It is my view that astrology possesses great potential in furthering the evolution of human development, which has gone largely untapped. In every field, mankind is capable of making great strides forward, and in fact, given the state of humanity now, it is imperative we do so in every way possible. Astrology is no exception to this necessity, and yet, in its present state, appears to be turning backwards to the way it was practiced centuries ago. The purpose of this school is to present a new model of astrology that focuses on how this field can contribute to one's spiritual evolution or transformation. First, we need to discover more about where we are right now in the development of the field of astrology, as well as how it's being practiced. And to do that, it's important to briefly summarize how astrology began and what the significant developments of astrology over the past centuries has been. So let me start by giving you a brief history of astrology. It is difficult for modern man to appreciate the intense relationship our predecessors had with the night sky. At a time when we barely notice anything in the sky, our forefathers observed and were moved by it in ways we cannot conceive of. They went further to notice correspondences between the sky above and events on Earth and recorded them. But their conclusions were necessarily completely connected with their daily lives. Individuality was not yet relevant to them. Thus, astrology was primarily focused on the king and his life. This is because what happened to the king happened to the nation, and what happened to the nation happened to the people. The astrologers of old were part of an educated priesthood and had real responsibilities. Their predictions were important and valued, but there was little concern for matters pertaining to any specific person. Now let's go to traditional or medieval astrology and move forward to the 1500s and to 1600s, when astrology began to become more sophisticated. Mathematics was a growing field at that time, and with Johann Kepler, astronomy was developing to new heights. New techniques were emerging in what was a real renaissance. And yet, astrology remained very predictive-oriented. It had to, because that was the need of the time period. Also, philosophically, it supported the view that life was quite fated and that the stars compelled things to happen. That life is fated was the basic view of the ruling Catholic Church and was accepted as truth. There were exceptions to this going back to many of the Greek philosophers, but this was more of an exception from the dominant beliefs. Astrologers used horary astrology and seldom did birth charts in the way we do now. The rules of interpretation were strict and focused on answering questions that could be answered with a yes or a no. This concrete predictive astrology was the only kind. At this time, the economic and social system was feudalism. If you were not part of the nobility, you had few rights and little money, so that the individual was not that important. Life was survival-based, with the average lifespan being only 35 years. Astrology was practiced to help people survive, and those were naturally the kinds of questions people asked their astrologer if they could pay for one. Astrologers then had to be astronomers first in order to be capable of erecting charts. Thus, naturally, there were few astrologers. One was Johann Kepler, who is famous for discovering the 3 laws of planetary motion. One competitor of his was Tycho Brahe, who battled with him over who had the best tables used to create their charts. The issue of whether or not astrology could consistently and reliably make concrete prediction was not debated fundamentally. Next, let's look at the beginnings of democracy. In the 1770s, a trend to democracy emerged, and with it so did the beginnings of the importance of the individual. One of the most important developments of this was the Bill of Rights, created in the United States. And it stated that individuals had inalienable rights that superseded any governmental authority. Please look at this for a moment. While we are still debating this at the present time, it did set into motion a new relationship possible between the individual and their leaders and government. Next, I want to look at the emergence of the field of psychology. While the study of the mind and human behavior dates back to the ancient Greeks and their philosophies, as a study that stood on its own, psychology didn't begin until the 1870s, according to many scholars. With the birth of psychology, the importance of the individual took a large leap forward. What needs to be emphasized here is that the notion that an individual person's life really matters is a very modern idea. Even when the founders of the United States wrote the U.S. Constitution, neither women nor non-landowners were allowed to vote, and black slaves and Native Americans had few rights. This is an important thing to remember, as we tend to take for granted the idea that our belief that an individual life is important is very recent in historical terms. Astrology naturally reflected this historical movement. So even though I am suggesting that the way astrology was, and even to some degree is being practiced today, is limited, there are historical reasons for it. And now I want to look at the emergence of Sigmund Freud and the existence of the unconscious world. The most important contribution that Sigmund Freud made, which occurred only 100 years ago, was the notion that there's an unconscious part of us that controls many aspects of our psyche without our conscious awareness. This meant that the human psyche would need to plunge itself into the subconscious depths in order to be able to understand itself. This view suggested that the term ego could be defined as the conscious part of us, which is the part we already know as ourself. But now, in order to have a bigger sense of who we are, we would have to add the unconscious aspects. Freud urged us to go deeper than our conscious mind and believed that if we did not do this, we would remain in an infantile and repressed state. Please remain aware that this theory occurred only 100 years ago, which in human development is just a small bit of time in our evolution. Following Freud was Carl Jung's work with his introduction of the concept of the archetype. Carl Jung was a disciple of Freud, but broke from his theories and came to a very different view of the nature of the unconscious. He not only considered the existence of a personal unconscious, but also a collective unconscious composed of archetypal elements or themes. His theories, which are still marginalized by modern psychology, had the potential of putting psychology on a completely different footing. To give a specific example, he began to understand the universality of rebelling against the mother and her enfolding love, and with that, the need to emerge from the collective womb. This view enabled us to take our first steps to recognizing that human beings are unconsciously tied to our conditioning. It is this discovery that allows for a person to begin to make a conscious effort to engage in what Jung referred to as the process of individuation, which is an individualizing process that exists in potential for all of us. But also he saw that this process did not happen automatically, which meant that it didn't happen to every person. And in fact, it might even be quite rare. Jung stepped into the idea that we could evolve. As a therapist, I know how difficult it can be for a person to change in a fundamental way. So now let's look at the beginning of the paradigm shift occurring in astrology. With the advent of the broad changes we see in psychology, the climate for a new form of astrology also began to emerge, and took place with the works of Dane Rudhyar, who not only connected astrology with psychology, but also with the spiritual and transformational movements that were emerging in his time period. His contributions to astrology are historically so significant that it is important to look at how he began to reshape how astrology can be viewed. Dane Rudhyar, in a real sense, was the father of transpersonal psychology. He was born in Paris in 1895, which was an astrologically very significant year, and lived until the age of 90. Some have regarded him as one of the top 5 astrologers of the 20th century. He was a musician and artist, as well as an astrologer with a deep background in the metaphysics of his day. He was influenced by the Theosophical Society, the works of Helena Blavatsky, as well as by many psychologists of his time. Let me take a moment to give a brief description of the development of Theosophy. It is fair to say that there would not be a New Age movement without it. The two books penned by Blavatsky began a worldwide organization that brought spirituality to the four corners of the planet. My study of the importance of this organization is that few people today realize how catalytic it was in bringing forth so many new spiritual viewpoints that it's easy to forget how affected our world is by what happened at this time. Also, the growth of the Theosophical Society had many indirect influences. Its influence spread into many other fields, such as psychology, which in small ways began to spiritualize the field, as evidenced by Sigmund Freud, Carl Jung, Fritz Kunkel, Roberto Assagioli, and many others. Rudyard was the first astrologer to take on the challenge of bringing astrology and psychology together, and more specifically, transpersonal or depth psychology. He wrote many books on this subject, but the main one was called Astrology and the Modern Psyche. He reviewed the developments in psychology from Freud to Jung, as well as other psychologists who were open to expanded views on the nature of the psyche. In addition, he also simultaneously showed the relevance of astrology to these developments and added ways in which astrology could make a unique contribution to what Jung called the process of individuation. One of the major influences for Rudyard arose with his close relationship with Roberto Assagioli, the developer of a new form of therapy named psychosynthesis. This type of approach rejected the pathologizing of the patient. Instead, he believed that the task of therapy is to aid the individual in transforming the personality and integrating apparent contradictions. Like Carl Jung, Assagioli stressed the need for a person to develop the higher psychic functions and embrace the spiritual dimension. Compare this with where psychology is today for the most part. Just as in quantum physics, the new forms of thought developing in the early 1900s, with its tremendous enthusiasm, has been lost in the postmodern materialism since 1980. This influence assisted Rudyard to understand that astrology can be thought of as a true transformational path that could lead to the experience of higher states of awareness and consciousness. This was an enormous paradigm shift in astrology, and its effects today are still being felt. As a result of these influences, he was the first person to use the term transpersonal psychology, which he did in 1930. For him, that term always included astrology. He showed that there's an underlying unity between astrology and psychology, especially depth psychology, and that they can be considered to be one field. In fact, he regarded the terms depth psychology, transpersonal psychology, transformational psychology, and spiritual psychology as synonymous. Now let's question the reliability and value of prediction. Let's do so fundamentally. In the 1920s, there were incredible discoveries made in quantum physics that questioned the very nature of reality. Along with the work of Werner Heisenberg and his uncertainty principle, scientists and philosophers alike began to seriously question if we can leave out the importance of the observer and what happens in this reality. Thus, the astrologer's view that concrete predictions could be made, which had been the bedrock of an astrologer's practice, was, in my view, no longer tenable. Dane Rudyard, with his psychological and spiritual knowledge, went much further when he stated that, quote, "To know the future, even if it's understood that there can be knowledge only of the potentiality of future events, is not of itself conducive to personal integration. It is not of itself sound psychological knowledge. Even the knowledge of what course of action is likely to be more successful in a given situation is not of itself psychologically valuable," unquote. This interferes with a person's process of growth or evolution. There are at least 3 distinct problems with trying to make concrete predictions. The first is the danger of the self-fulfilling prophecy. Once we've heard a prediction, it cannot be unheard. It changes our thoughts and behaviors about the matter. For example, if we're told that we will meet our true love in 6 months, what will we think if we meet someone in a month or 12 months? Will we either reject that person or wonder if we should have waited for the promised person to come into our life? Secondly, predictive astrology often promotes an unhealthy dependence on the advice of highly fallible practitioners. The desire of the client to know exactly what will happen is often what most clients need in order to relieve their fear of the unknown. But this fear is fostered instead of assisting the client to engage with the unknowns that one finds oneself in the midst of and seeking a higher understanding and a greater participation in the process that they're in and which is unfolding. So not only do we have an unhealthy dependence created, but also an approach that defeats the potential value of what the person's experiencing. Thirdly is the loss of a sense of free will. Trying to predict the future is disempowering. It caters to the psychic need a person has to relieve themselves from the pain of uncertainty, but without realizing it, conversely, one is also relieved from the power of choice. It is in a state of uncertainty where we can grow, transform, evolve, and move into truly new territory. It's where our freedom actually exists. Certainty means we do not have any choice. Life is happening to us without our participation. After Dane Rudhyar's work, other astrologers such as Liz Green, Stephen Arroyo, Stephen Forrest, etc., openly stressed the need to expand astrology beyond the predictive model that had been its bread and butter for the past centuries. There is still a debate in astrology of how it ought to handle the issues of fate versus free will, which impacts how astrology is practiced. In 2002, at an ESAR conference, Richard Tarnas made 2 somewhat controversial statements that can help us understand where astrology might be going right now and what it's struggling with. First, he stated that astrology cannot make concrete predictions, but that it can make archetypal ones, thematic ones. Second, that a practicing astrologer ought to become expert in at least one other field that is connected to the form of astrological practice that they're working in. As you might see, astrology is in the midst of shifting to a new approach and to even a new paradigm in how it views the nature of our life purpose and of the reality we live in. More importantly, astrology is having to consider how it can become relevant to human development in light of the new knowledge humanity is now discovering and hopefully applying.